Hey everybody, before we get started, I just wanted to let you know that the first book from Faith Matters Publishing is now available. It's called All Things New and was written by Fiona and Terryl Givens. When I finished the book, I just thought this has so much potential to actually change lives. They go through and trace the roots of our religious vocabulary and show how so many of these words have become totally unmoored from their original foundation, and how a lot of those traditions have been carried forward for hundreds and even thousands of years and are in a lot of ways still damaging us today. And then they dive into how we can reformulate our language in healthy and inspiring ways. This book is so healing, it's hopeful, it's a totally paradigm-shifting book that you will not be able to put down. You can pick up a copy for yourself or for friends and family. It's available at Desert Book, on Amazon, Audible, and Apple Books. We're so grateful for Terryl and Fiona and all of the amazing work that they've done here. All right, that's all for the book for now, but we have a lot more to come. Thanks as always, and here's the episode.
Hey everybody, this is Tim Chavez with Faith Matters. One of John Curtis's first votes after winning re-election as a U.S. Congressman in 2020 was one of the toughest decisions of his life, whether or not to impeach Donald Trump for instigating a mob attack on the U.S. Senate during its vote to ratify Joe Biden's election as the next U.S. president. In this conversation with his longtime friend, Terryl Givens, Curtis talks about that vote, the current political climate in America, and how we might heal the divisions in our country. They also talk about what role Curtis's deep personal faith plays in his public life, first as a mayor and now as a U.S. Congressman. He explores this and more in a very personal conversation with Terryl Givens. Thanks so much for listening, and as always, we hope you enjoy this conversation.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Conversations with Terryl Givens, sponsored by Faith Matters Organization. I'm your host, Terryl Givens. And today we have as a guest one of my oldest and truest of friends.
Oldest, ouch.
And mentors. A really dear and beloved friend to me, John Curtis, who is currently serving as Congressman. John Curtis, welcome to the show.
Terrell, I can't tell you how pleased I am to be with you. You alluded to our friendship, and it's just a warm friendship for me and your wife and your family, and so many good memories for so many years.
Thank you. Yeah, it's true. You were bishop of the Monument.
So it was started as the Tuckahoe Ward.
Tuckahoe Ward. That's right.
Name,
that's right.
The Tuckahoe Ward.
Yeah.
We split partway through, and it became the Gayton Ward.
That's right. And so you were bishop. You were my bishop, and then I inherited that mantle a few years later, a few years down the road.
And let me just throw this in. You were our gospel doctrine teacher. And I'm just telling you, there is nothing like sitting. If you've all read Terrell's readings, imagine having him for your gospel doctrine teacher. Well, I miss that.
I'm really fortunate. I have got that calling again.
Do you really?
I'll hold on to it.
I'm going to move into your
as
ward
long as I can. Well, let's see. Generally, we have any number of topics that we could bring up to discuss on a conversation like this. But the events of the past few days have centered around certain events that have kind of come to the forefront. You are practically hot off the plane, returning from Washington, where you were effectively summoned to vote on a certain...
Impeach the president.
To impeach the president of the United States.
Yeah.
And you voted...
Not to impeach.
Not to impeach. I'm sure that no matter which way you voted, you'd have had a lot of flack.
A lot of frustrated people all over. There's no doubt. Yeah.
President Trump has gotten to a point where he has very few defenders left, even within his party. So why did you not join the bandwagon and impeach the guy? Well, I guess there wasn't much of a bandwagon in the House Republicans, were there?
Well, let me try to explain it. And hopefully I can take just a few minutes and share what's in my mind and in my heart about the experience. I learned on Sunday that Nancy Pelosi intended to do this on Wednesday. On Monday morning, they filed the articles of impeachment, and I hopped on a plane on Tuesday, and Wednesday we voted. And maybe to give you the best answer, and there are other answers, but probably to give you the best answer is imagine a prosecutor who got to be both prosecutor and jury and judge, who announced that he was going to convict somebody of a crime before that individual even was known to them, and then tried to do it and was unsuccessful, and then announced that they were going to do that in 48 hours. that they were going to hear all the witnesses, that they were going to hear the defense, that they were going to study the facts of the case. And I found myself saying it's just too big of a violation of the fundamental bedrock of our judicial system to accuse, to judge, and to sentence in 48 hours. I don't want anybody to imply from that I'm not very, very troubled by the actions of the president. I don't want anybody to imply from that I don't think there were grievous mistakes, sins, errors by the president. But I couldn't do that in 48 hours. I couldn't, on a vote that's tough, I need 48 hours of quiet time.
Yeah.
To digest it. This was clearly the hardest vote that I've taken while I've been in Congress, and likely while I've been there. And I got zero quiet time to process this. Several weeks earlier, I'd been asked to vote on a budget that was 6,000 pages, and I was given 3 hours to read that, and I voted no. Not that I didn't like the budget, I just didn't know. I hadn't read the budget, and this is not a whole lot different from that. I got to tell you, it weighs very heavily on my mind that I did vote no. I mean, there was no peace in this for me in any direction that I went.
So if not for these procedural irregularities and the rush to judgment, you imagine that you might have been more willing to vote yes?
Well, I certainly think that there were serious, and I want to say impeachable offenses, but I also... You need time to study that out. You know, if I ask you what an impeachable offense is, I don't know anybody that's going to give you a straight answer, right? And so it takes time to process that. Add to that this impeachment will not be concluded while the president is in office. We all knew that. What's the rush? Why not slow down? I suspect that facts will come to light that will be more damning for the president over time. Why not? Let that play out. Right.
So you don't see yourself as a defender of the president?
Absolutely not. Now, I have to admit, there's a little bit of me, and I kind of played into this, that like, come on, guys, you announced you were going to impeach him 4.5 years ago. Terryl, you and I had a chance to talk about this a little bit before. I saw firsthand evil on both sides of this. And so when I'm asked to pick who's the greater evil. Well, I think President Trump is in this case. I don't deny that, but I just, I saw deep evil in this whole process.
Well, let me see if we can segue from there into a more general conversation about the predicament of a disciple of Christ in the contemporary political environment in America, and I want to develop something that you said about evil versus evil. It has always struck me that one of the glories of LDS theology is that for the rest of the Judeo-Christian world, the story of Eden is a very simple story of good versus evil, right? They could be obedient or they could be rebellious. And so we have all of this kind of very simplistic moralizing from that story in Eden. And Joseph Smith takes this story, right, and refashions it into one of the most perplexing and morally challenging dilemmas, where Eve is confronted with the option of obedience on the one hand, or sacrifice and fulfillment of the Father's plan on the other, and opening herself and her posterity to experience and pain and suffering. And so people like John A. Whitsoe, for example, one of the brethren, who said clearly her choice was between two goods. And so it seems to me that Latter-day Saints should have a fairly sophisticated understanding of the moral complexities of this world, and that the most difficult decisions aren't those between good and evil, but they're between good and good. So why can't we get it that in today's political environment, it's largely the question of a choice between evil and evil, and just recognize that there's no comfortable place for discipleship today.
We like black and white.
Yeah.
We like yes, no. Politicians are fabulous at painting the yes for you on their side and the no on the other side. And my reality is in Congress, there's rarely a vote that is black-white.
Yeah.
I'm almost always asked to vote on 6 things I like and 4 things I don't in a bill. Or does that make sense, or vice versa? And in almost all of our legislation, this COVID legislation that we've just passed is a really good example. There's parts of the bill I really don't like, but I'm really worried about individuals and small businesses, right? And most of my work is not black and white. And I might just mention, I think we tend to look at parties like a religion.
Yeah, we sure do.
And if your party is a religion, you must defend it no matter what, right? And you have no allowance for error or for being wrong. And let's face it, both parties, you give them any length of time, you're going to see serious moral flaws, right, in either party or individuals that represent either parties. I can point to parts of the Democratic platform where I think they've done a much better job than Republicans, and climate is one that just jumps out at me as one of those, where my party has failed and is not doing well at all. Likewise, I could spend a lot of time saying, okay, well, I think my party's done well in A, B, and C, right, and the other party hasn't. Yeah. But it's not a black-white, one's always right, one's always wrong.
Well, so politics is the art of compromise, right? So here's another question for you. As a striving disciple, how do you work out in your own mind the conflict, the tension between righteousness and integrity and purity on the one hand, and pragmatism on the other? The fact that we can't, right, let the perfect be the enemy of the good, that we have to make compromises, that there isn't any party that has a monopoly on goodness or values. How do you know when you're going too far in losing your soul?
Well, I think it's important to establish a difference between if I'm compromising on, let's say, COVID legislation, and I'm saying, fine, I'm willing to let you spend money in this category. That's not my favorite, right, that I wouldn't spend. I don't view that as tearing away the moral fabric. But now, if we have pro-life legislation in front of us, that's really hard for people to compromise on either side. And so I think
and that's to me is one of the most troubling, is that every survey shows that for example, the Democrats are completely out of sync in being unwilling to make any kind of moderation, right? Any moderation to the position expressed by Buttigieg, for example, right? That up until that moment of birth, right, you have an unrestricted right to abort that child, and so it creates this dilemma where there is no moderate ground that it's an option anymore for American voters on so many of these issues.
But I probably picked a bad one, because abortion is black-white to many people. Now, I guess there are some areas. Let's talk about life of the mother, right? And I think there's some things that are worthy of debate.
Right.
But let's talk about immigration, right? We have failed on immigration because the extremists will not compromise. And this is an area where we should compromise.
Right.
We have failed to do what's best for the American people because we won't compromise. And that's kind of the contrast I'm trying to make between, like, okay, here's an area where compromise is not going to undermine your moral fabric on immigration. Right, we've got to find common ground here if we're going to do what's best for the country.
Is the possibility of a third party just gone with Ross Perot? I mean, it seems to me that if we could find a party that had views more consonant with gospel teachings on the environment, on education, on the poor, but on the life of the child and tolerance and genuine liberalism. But is that just from your experience in Washington? Is that no longer possible?
I've thought of this analogy a lot, and I've never really expressed it. So let me see if it makes any sense coming out of my mouth. It may not. It's a lot like a team sport in Washington, D.C. What do we mean by that? If I want some legislation to be passed, I've got to have a team with me, right? And when the teams are fairly evenly split, as more often than not they are in Washington, right? It's you get dominance from time to time, but it balances itself out.
There's less crossover today than at any point in the past, right?
There's far less. But guess what? If you want to pass a bill, you better cross over, because you're not going to. There are no partisan bills that pass anymore, with a couple of notable exceptions: the Affordable Care Act and tax reform. Notice both of those that passed on a partisan basis are under attack, and will continue to be under attack because they didn't slow down and get partisan support. But now imagine if I go back to Washington, D.C., and there's 435 members of Congress, and I'm a team of one. Or let's suppose, hypothetically, I get a team of 10. You can see the impossibility of being effective back there when it's a team sport, when it really is a team sport. And so it would be not so difficult for somebody to win an election as an independent. It happens from time to time. It becomes very difficult for them to be anything more than a spokesperson once they get back there.
Yeah, my wife Fiona, of course, is British by birth, and she can't understand why we can't adopt the British system, right? Of many parties, so that we have to form coalitions, we have to learn to compromise, we have to learn to be more team players. But let me. I don't want to change the subject. I want to change the tone a little bit.
Okay.
I mean, this has been such a bleak period of time in American history and in the church's history, because many of these divisions and polarizations are replicating themselves in the church.
Sure.
Because, as you said, it's so hard for people to separate religion from politics. We treat them
both. It goes both directions. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So give us reason for hope. What did you encounter in Washington that gave you hope that there's still good in people and good in our system?
I love the question, and I'll tell you why. Because there is hope. And let me share a couple of examples of that. I'm just going to throw out the number of 80%. I don't know if that's accurate. 80% of my colleagues wake up in the morning and hope that they'll move the ball forward for America. And they work with Democrats and Republicans across the aisle, and they come up with thoughtful proposals, and they compromise, and they work hard together. And guess what? When they get a bill across the finish line, you don't hear about it on the news. And I give you some really strong examples of that. On the other side are these extremes. Maybe it's 10% on each side, right? And they stand up and they yell things like "Crooked Hillary," and they stand up and yell "impeach," right? And some of them wake up in the morning and they put makeup on. Guys put makeup on because they want to be on Fox News that afternoon and they want to look good. Yeah. Well, guess who gets heard back home? And so America gets this impression that that's what's happening in Congress. I have the joy of working with men and women who are just like I am, but see things differently, and want to sit down, work, and pound out solutions with me. I mentioned that in an example. Let me give you this example. A year and a half ago, one of the largest problems in the country was opioid abuse. It's still large, but it was kind of at its climax and peak. And Republicans and Democrats came together and in the House prepared 60 bills. And one of the rare blessings is to stand on, be the speaker, to be delegated to be the Speaker of the House during debate. And that was delegated to me during the debate on these opioid bills. So I got to oversee these debates. And the Republicans stood up and they said, "This is a really good bill. Would like to thank our Democratic colleagues for their help on this bill. Please support this bill." That was their debate. Democrats stood up and said, "These are good bills. Would like to thank our Republican colleagues for their help on these bills. Please vote for these bills." I heard that 60 times.
I don't remember seeing that on the news.
And that's my point. 60 bills on one of the most important topics to our country at the time were passed in a nearly 100% bipartisan fashion. Went over to Senate. They wrapped it into one bill, passed it, and the president signed it into law, and nobody heard about that on the news. Yeah. And that's what we don't get to talk about enough, and that's what those extreme networks will not carry because nobody's calling each other an idiot, right? In that, and there's more of that than people would imagine going on.
Right. Well, Congressman, you rub shoulders with a lot of men and women in the House of Representatives. You get to know a lot of them pretty intimately and behind the scenes. What is your prediction for the next 4 years? is the bitterness too deep? The divisions too deep? You see on a lot of fronts, people arguing that we need to make blacklists of these people who are on the other side, and we need to kind of cancel them permanently in the future. Are we going to see waves of retribution, or do you think have our leaders had enough?
So
and they're ready to
let me
yield?
just say this was also a reason that impeachment was hard for me to vote for, because we have now set the standard, and you will see again in the not too far distant days Republicans impeaching a Democratic president in 48 hours without trials, without testimony, without witnesses. But let me give you two now arguments. Let me argue against myself here and give you 2 points. The first is one of the beauties of the United States of America is that we are what I call self-healing. And we have been in some really bad patches before. Civil War, Watergate, Bill Clinton's impeachment. And we have emerged stronger after each one of those than before. And I really believe that we have that opportunity in front of us. Now, the second point I want to make is, yes, it is incumbent on elected leaders to lead out. But people need to understand we are far more a reflection of those we represent than people would like to admit. President Trump is far more a reflection on who we are as a country.
Well, he's more popular than Pelosi in some polls, right?
75 million people 2 months ago voted for him knowing all his warts.
Yeah.
Almost half of the United States of America knew all of his warts and voted for him. And so while we want to look to our elected leaders to solve this, we've got to look in the mirror as well. How many people are leaving caustic remarks on social media? How many people are spreading rumors? How many people are too quick to judge, right? And that is, to me, at heart, the problem is that is more inbred into who we are than we're willing to admit.
Right. Looking to the future again, has President Trump permanently remade the Republican Party? Will this be a passing phase, or has the future been permanently altered?
I don't like my answer, but he has permanently altered the Republican Party, much like Ronald Reagan did.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting is many of these principles are not Republican. We have increased the deficit a gazillion times more than the Democrats have, not just with President Trump.
Yeah.
That's always been a hallmark of Republicans, is fiscal conservatism.
Right.
Government programs. We just saw this massive lobby by Republicans to spend $2,000 for every man, woman, and child under $150,000. That is nothing but a big redistribution of wealth, right? And so what's interesting is that, yes, there are some principles that he's held firm to that would be traditional conservative principles, but there are others that aren't. And I think the Republican Party needs to very, very quickly decide who we are and who our leaders are if we're going to have any success in 2 and 4 years.
Right. Let me turn this in a very personal direction, if I can. You began politics running, was the mayoral office your first, or there's one before that?
I'd forgotten that too. I think I know where you're going. I ran, I think it was 2000, actually as a Democrat.
Right,
for the state Senate.
See, I wasn't going to say that.
I know. It gets brought up everywhere. It's something for some reason I just can't shed. It's a big deal. And I guess the next question is why, and why now a Republican? And I'll let you ask the questions.
No, I'm not interested in that as much as I want to put it this way. If you were to ask probably 99% of political figures why they got into politics, they would say, well, because I wanted to make a difference. And I'm sure that to some extent that is one of your motivations. I guess I want to ask how your discipleship, your testimony play into that. Do they inform your political life and aspirations, or were they a central motivation behind your political aspirations? And then if I can give it a third twist, how successful do you feel that you have been in bringing into your calling, your office, those guiding principles and values that motivated you?
Let me skip that first run and to being a mayor. I served as mayor of Provo for 8 years. And nothing has been, family aside, more gratifying to me than that time. It was like...
More than the last 6 years? No, not. It's 3 years,
3
right?
years, yeah. Everything came together, principles of harmony, of goodwill, of prosperity.
You were a popular mayor.
I was well accepted.
Yeah.
It's hard on me.
That's why we moved here. We thought you were still mayor.
It was a good gig, and I loved every minute of it. And I felt like when I woke up in the morning, my city wanted me to be successful. They were cheering for me. Yeah. They supported me, and they gave me a lot of slack. And it was a good experience. The city prospered, and things were good. And I think if you'd have asked me that question at the end of that, I would say, it was like my mission. It was like 8 years of my 19-year-old mission, and the happiest time of my life, and I think a prosperous time for the city. And I don't know that you would say gospel principles, but goodwill and kindness and prosperity and all on harmony. I think all of those things, we were really on track.
And how long were you?
8 years. 8 years. Yeah. And I had a real worry and fear that if I stayed in that environment a long time, that I wouldn't be able to maintain that, nor should I, because when you're the mayor of a city and you enjoy vast popularity, it's not good for right? I mean, it's just, it's like too much money, right, or too much power, all those things.
And there's no term limit on them.
There's no term limit, and I felt like it was time to hand the reins to somebody else for a number of reasons. And this opportunity came up. And I think when you first started to ask this question, my mind first went to this, and then I realized your question was a little bit different, but I'll throw this in. For me to go to Congress, no less than 6 things had to happen that were unusual. Jason Chaffetz resigning midterm, the state putting a signature path in. I got 9% of the votes at the convention. I would have never survived and even been a candidate had not just months before the state had put a signature path in. The governor choosing in a special election to include that signature path, and there was a lot of pressure from the state legislature not to. One of my opponents deciding not to collect signatures, who very likely could have beat me. There were just a series of things, along with some just immense strong personal feelings that I was supposed to do this. And I say that carefully because I don't want people to think I feel like God wanted me to be in Congress. I do feel like he wanted me to run and have that experience. And I think there's a big difference between saying that I'm special and I should be in Congress. And so that shaped me a lot. But what happened is, instead of waking up in the morning and people cheering for me, I woke up in the morning and at least half of them were trying to make me fail. And then you look on what happens online, and the angst and the ugliness and all of that just came seeping out of everywhere.
Now, you'd seen this all from afar. Anybody does who follows the news. But did the intensity of it surprise you?
In a dramatic way. And maybe part of it's because, look, we were putting in parks and we were doing things that were increasing quality of life. And
not terribly controversial.
Yeah, well, and yes and no, because when you stand in front of a group of people and you're putting a road in their backyard, that's a different story. But these are not issues that for decades have been poisoned, like immigration. Yeah. And these are not issues for which people around the country will stay up all night long in their basement and leave caustic comments about your thoughts and your motives and things. And what I think is the consequence of this is we're not going to get good men and women to run and stay in office. I guarantee you, if there was an escape hatch 2 days ago, half of us would have escaped. Yeah. And the half that didn't escape are probably not the half you want there.
So what about going forward? What kinds of plans, aspirations, dreams you have?
I went to Congress to get things done, and I've got a team that wants to get things done. We've been very fortunate. We've passed, it's just short of a dozen bills in 3 years, and really good, important bills. And I need to either turn this corner of this like yuck and get back involved in what we were doing, or I'll probably explode. You'll find me in a million pieces, right? And that's what I aspire to is getting the work of the people done, passing legislation that impacts people's lives here in Utah. And there's so many needs and so many important things to get done. And I'm confident we can do that. That's where we've been most of my 3 years, and that's what we need to do.
Since the late 1960s, probably the church has trended Republican overwhelmingly in the United States. That's dropping off a little bit. There's still a strong majority, but not as much as in the past. Do you think it would be healthier for our church culture if there were a more even split between the parties among the members?
I have a suspicion. Now, you know the brethren better than I do. But I have a suspicion if they really came forward and declared a party, it'd be far more even than people would suspect.
Yeah.
There are issues that for many people are litmus test issues. And for our culture, some of those just make them Republicans. Yeah. And that won't change. But climate, particularly to our youth, I think if Republicans aren't careful, we'll lose the next generation of Republicans on that one issue.
Yeah. I don't know if you know the work of Jonathan Haidt, he's not a political scientist. He's, I think, trained more in psychology, but he wrote a book called The Righteous Mind. And I wish it were a requirement that everybody had to read that book before they could vote. Because he began writing that book as a political liberal, meaning pretty far to the left. And he undertook a series of studies to try to understand why do people fall where they do on the political spectrum. And his conclusions produced what I think is the most charitable interpretation of political difference that anybody's ever been able to present. And that's why I think it's such a beautiful and powerful work. His conclusion is that on both sides of the political spectrum, we are devoted to values, but we assign different priorities to these values. So in this kind of an analysis, there aren't any bad guys. It's just that equality is really, really important to one person. Reverence for the sacred is for somebody else. And I just think that gives us a lens through which to look across the aisle and see the best in our political opponents and adversaries. And I'm wondering if your experience in Washington has helped you to do that, having to work so closely with people on the other side of the political spectrum. Have you developed a greater appreciation for the goodness and their values?
If you'll indulge me, I want to tell you one of my favorite stories. I had a big public lands bill. It was 1 million acres. It was a big deal. It's been decades since we've passed something like that in Utah. And there was a Democratic congressman standing in the way of that bill. And he and I saw things very differently. And I went to him with my staff and met with his staff, and we laid out all the charts on the tables of these public lands that we were considering. And I looked him in the eye and I said, my goal is to get you to not hate my bill. He laughed and he said, okay, for me not to hate it, it's going to take, and he gave us a list of things. And we went away and we worked really hard, and we were able to bring my Republican colleagues to a point where they could tolerate and he could tolerate. And we came back to him, and he ended up voting, not only not hating my bill, but voting for my bill. And then in some twist of fate, we all had to move offices, and I moved into his office. And I then sat in that very chair that he sat in. It was so rewarding and fun for me to see things through his eyes, and to see that I could see things through his eyes and he could see things through my eyes. And that's the magic, right? And that's the magic to a bill that people like and don't fight, when it's through. And it was a really fun experience. And up until COVID, every time he saw me in the hall, he would stop, he'd hand his books to somebody, and he'd come and give me a hug. And really one of the choicest friendships that I have in Congress.
Yeah. Well, you remind me of a couple of things by telling that story. One is one of my favorite sayings from the Talmud, which is, we see the world not as it is, but as we are. Yeah. And I think one of the things that I love both about you and about Judge Griffith, who I've had on here before, is that if anybody has an excuse to be more cynical than most of us, it's those who have been in the inner workings, been in the eye of the hurricane. And yet both you and Judge Griffith have said the same thing, that working closely with these individuals, you learn that they want the good, and that they want to achieve it at times in different ways than we do. But I think that's a very cheering perspective for you to bring to us today. I'm really grateful that you've done that. One final couple of questions I want to ask is, how many mornings do you wake up and regret your decision to be a congressman?
I would probably say in my 3 years, probably once. And it was.
Is that right?
It was the day of the impeachment vote. I love my job. It's an amazing honor. Think about this, Terryl. I get to walk the halls of the Capitol. At night, I can go over there all by myself and walk in the halls of the Capitol. And I walk up and down the steps where Abraham Lincoln walked, or these huge icons in American history. How could I not love that, right? How could that not be just a very, very special experience? This last week will pass, and I'll look back and be glad I'm in Congress. You caught me at a time, right, where it's the wound is really raw. But it's an amazing experience, and almost every day I wake up and I'm grateful for this opportunity.
Well, Congressman Curtis, thank you for being with us today. It's been an honor to have you, and glad to be with you again. And you have my hope and prayers going forward that you can help to bring charity back into our nation's capital and into our discourse.
I will take that as a challenge from a very, very dear friend. Thank you, Terrell. It's been just a delight to be with you.
Thank you. So long, and thanks for being with us today.
Thanks so much for listening, and a special thanks again to Congressman Curtis for coming on to speak with Terrell. And as always, to everybody who's left a positive review of our podcast or content on any platform, we really do appreciate it. We read each review and comment and are grateful for the encouragement and for helping get the word out about Faith Matters. And of course, as always, you can check out more at faithmatters.org.